It's all right, you're not getting a sermon from me today. It is instead my very great pleasure to welcome Rabbi Sybil Sheridan as our guest preacher this morning. In many ways, Rabbi Sheridan needs no introduction. She's a member of the Synagogue. She served our community as a student. She teaches our Shabbat morning learning with texts class regularly, Michael's class, and is well known to many of our members. Rabbi Sheridan has served communities in Ealing, Reading, Wimbledon, West London, and now looks after the community who fell in love with her when she was a student. I think you fell in love with them as well. Newcastle Reformed Synagogue. It's not exactly on your doorstep, but you're a regular commuter. She has a deep interest in interfaith matters and was one of the very first Jews to study theology at Cambridge. She founded the organization Maketa, supporting Jews living in Ethiopia, and has led several visits there and is about to lead the Jewish Renaissance tour to India next month. A lot of work, of preparation. Are there any places left?
Well, places, not so many people.
Anyway, we welcome you. Barucha haba'a b'shem Adonai, berachnuchem mibeit Adonai.
Thank you so much. That was a lovely introduction. Oh, it's amazing standing here. Having loved looking at it from the other point of view. Yes, well. Very emotional. Parashat Vayiggash that we read today marks the climax of the story of Joseph that really started 3 weeks ago. And it's read, of course, in Orthodox synagogues. The whole story is read. And so we don't get quite the same weight of the drama, perhaps, since we only dip in and out of the story. Because you have to imagine the weekly Torah reading rather like a sort of television serial. You get involved in the story, and then just as you get to the bit where the 10 brothers attack Joseph, that's the end of the week, and you have to wait for the next Shabbat's thrilling installment. And then the next week, Joseph arrests one of his brothers, and you think, what kind of revenge will come next? But you have to wait another week to find out. Of course, everyone knows the story, but that doesn't dull the effect. Like any good classic, it is the way it is written that thrills as much as the plot itself. But there is another story, equally thrilling but in a very different way, that hovers around the margins of the story of Joseph. And this is what I'd like to look at today. It's something that is developed fully in Midrash, but you only get hints of in the Torah text itself. We read today of how the brothers returned home and told their father that Joseph was still alive. And it seems that Jacob had some kind of heart attack in the news. In our Torah translation, we were told his heart froze because he couldn't believe them. And something had to happen to revive his spirit so that he could take in the news. And what happened depends rather on the rather boring passage that follows what we read today, which is a list of the names of all the people who went with Jacob down to Egypt. Among them were Asher's sons. Jacob's son Asher had Imnah, Ishva, Ishvi, and Beriah, and their sister Serah. Now, who is Serah, you might well ask? Well, the reality is nobody knows. But Torah, which is sparing in its mentions, only uses words of significance. So there must be something about Serah that meant something to people at the time the story was written, although we have no idea now. But here's the thing. There is another list of people who traveled in Sinai with Moses to the Promised Land. And amongst them is Serach bat Asher. This is some 400 years later. And as if that's not enough, there is a list of the descendants of the tribes alive in the time of King Hezekiah, some 300 years further on. And she's there too. This lady lived a very long time. And so it is that, of course, Midrash develops a story. And we learn that Serach was raised in the house of Jacob and walked in the way of the pious children. And God gave her beauty, wisdom, and sagacity. That's according to Ginsberg's Legends of the Jews. And it so happened that when the 10 sons of Jacob returned to Canaan to bring Jacob back, at the entrance to Jacob's property, they stopped and pondered. What was going to happen when they told Jacob that Joseph was still alive? He was old and frail. Would he survive the news? Would he actually believe them? Because, as you all know, the words of a liar are never believed. And it was at this point they chanced upon Serach, their Asher's daughter, who was a skilled harpist and sang beautifully. So they prevailed on her to sing the news to Jacob. And so it was that she sang, "Joseph, my uncle lives. He rules over the whole of Egypt. He is not dead." And she began singing it very quietly. And then with each repetition of these words, she sang louder and more assertively, so that gradually Jacob's spirit was awakened in him, and he knew that she was telling the truth. The power that music has to reach the spirit where words alone cannot. And so it was that Jacob blessed Serah for telling him the news, saying, "The angel of death will never rule over you." She was to live forever. There is a grave to Serah, but Asher in Isfahan, but that's not part of this story. So it is that she lived on through the centuries, witnessing the death and burial of Joseph, and was enslaved to the millstones in Egypt. It was, according to Midrash, that Serach bat Asher showed Moses where Joseph was buried. Without the bones of Joseph, they would not have been able to leave Egypt because they had promised to take them, to bury them in the land of Canaan. And so while the rest of the Israelites were loading themselves with gold, Moses started on the frantic and fruitless search to find Joseph until Serah told him where he lay. And so it was that Serach bat Asher became instrumental in the two activities that were fundamental to the story of Israel. She ensured that Jacob left Canaan for Egypt so that they had their sojourn in Egypt, and she it was who enabled them to leave it and return back to the promised land. Later on, Serach is identified with the wise woman of Arvel. This is part of the story of King David, where one Sheva ben Bichri led a rebellion against him and set himself up as king. David's commander, Yoav, put down the rebellion very quickly, and Sheva fled to Arvel, a city that was loyal to him, while Yoav's troops besieged the city. What happened next is now partly in Torah, but there is an embellishment in Midrash. The wise woman of Arvel negotiated the handing over of Sheva to Yoav in the following way. Knowing that the citizens would simply not betray the man that they had supported going on, she went to Yoav to negotiate and returned to the leaders of the city, who asked, "What is it that Yoav wants?" And she replied, 1,000 men. And they said to her, "Well, we'll see what we can do. 1,000 is a lot of men, but, if it saves the city, we'll hand over 1,000. Wait," she said, "I'll go and see if I can bring the number down." Went back to Yoav, pretended to go back to Yoav, came back having pretended to have a negotiation with him and said, actually, Yoav will be okay with 500. Okay, they said, still a tall order, but I think we can manage it. Wait, she said, don't do anything just yet. I'll talk to him again. She pretended to go back, talked to him again, pretended to talk to him back, came back and said, actually, Yoav will be content with just one man, and he's not one of us. He's a stranger among us. It's Sheva ben Bichri. Okay, they said, no problem. Here he is, and they tossed his head over the ramparts. Okay, the negotiation is something reminiscent, perhaps, of Abraham arguing with God, and the comparison is not accidental. The wise woman of Avel is seen as a woman of great authority and wisdom. And Serach's reputation and authority grows in the retelling of her stories, particularly when you get into rabbinic literature. 1,000 years later, she appeared to Rabbi Yochanan, who was teaching his students, and she corrected him on his interpretation about the crossing of the Red Sea. After all, she'd been there. She knew what really happened. And also, when there was a discussion about how come the Israelites actually believed Aaron and Moses when they came to them after hundreds of years of slavery and told them, we are going to lead you to freedom. How come they believed them? Serach was able to give them the answer. She said that there had been a secret password that she had been given by Jacob, which she then related to Moses and Aaron. The words were, I will surely visit you. And these words, she then told the Israelites, would be the ones that would point the way to the man who would redeem Israel from slavery. And these instances really echo the role of Elijah, who also, as you know, didn't die, and who is allegedly still alive. Both of them pointing the way to someone who will redeem Israel. And this, of course, became a big thing in the crypto-Jewish communities, the Anusim in Spain and Portugal, who had visions. One particular prophet, Amari Gomez, had a vision of Elijah and Serach walking hand in hand, announcing the Messiah together. And there are other stories of Serach bat Asher having that role alone. And so it seems here we have a woman who is wise and knowledgeable and authoritative, an agent of significant change in the fortunes of Israel, that has been a source of encouragement for many women down the age until somehow her story got forgotten. Of course, it's all pure myth, but there is a truth in myth. Indeed, I've heard myth described as truth told in a story. And what is the truth here? Well, it's not just the flash charismatic leaders that alter the course of history, but those who quietly stay in the background, who can effect great change. Shabbat Shalom.